That's the same way I was about sitting in the choir by Paul Sheets. That's how I learned to sing tenor, or what I know about tenor. That's where I learned it, was from sitting by Paul and trying to mock him, I guess, or copy him as he was hitting those notes. You know, we talked this morning in the message a little bit about the number of people that were here last Sunday, and then, you know, maybe not so many here this morning, but, you know, like it was said, we're still serving the same risen Lord this Sunday as we were last Sunday. And if we're here next Sunday, it'll be the same. So, and there's some songs that, you know, I kind of relate to Easter still that we didn't get to do. So we're going to do maybe one or two of those to start out with. But the first one is number 312, He Lives. 312. Number 243. 243. I think those girls are need help finding the pages.
Hey, do you think I can read it?
Does it have that?
Well, you done got it for you. You done got it. Look at it, you got it. That's got it.
Sorrow
Anybody got a request? Got one you want to do? Which one? 155. All right. Number 155. And for our last one, number 190. 190.
'Tis spread and said there will still be no don't know if you recognize the song that Brother Eddie ended with, but it was "Oh Say But I'm Glad." I am glad that they are the ones going back and caring for the kids. I don't know if Eddie planned that or not. No, we look past it sometimes, but man, what a blessing we have to have that many young people in church and to be here on Sunday night. So we're thankful for that and thankful for their parents as well. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2.
That's not quite as bad as when I played it one other time.
When was that?
Years ago, we had a pastor leaving here.
And you played "Oh Say But I'm Glad."
I was at the radio station then, and so we had a gospel song today at about 6:10. Suzanne called and she said, "Eddie, they're just ready to pull out, play the gospel song today." Well, I already had it queued up on the turntable, and I started it up, and it was "Oh Say But I'm Glad."
Well,
So I played them a gospel song today, "Oh Say But I'm Glad," if they could leave it time.
I had Hoover Lewis was his name, older Free Will Baptist minister. And he told me this. He said, "I made everybody in the church happy at one point or another." He said, "Some of them were happy when I came. The rest of them were happy when I left." But he said, "I made them all happy at one point." So, Exodus chapter 2. This was part of the Sunday school lesson this morning. How far did y'all get into the lesson? Did y'all get it all covered, Kevin? Pretty much. Eddie, how far did y'all get it all?
Actually, I did, but it was kind of a condensed version.
Okay. Same. Well, we're going to go back and spend a little bit of time on it. Joey, how far did you get?
Halfway.
Halfway, maybe? Okay. The thought of today's lesson was looking at Moses and his life. And of course, if you break Moses' life down, you could spend a long time talking about him and talking about his character. There were certain spots that the author of the lesson kind of picked out in order to look at. And one of those was actually when he was born. And so chapter 2 speaks about that. And of course, you have to go back into chapter 1 of Exodus to really understand why chapter 2 happens. And I'm not going to spend as much time on that. Hopefully you know the story. Moses was born. It was in a time where the Hebrew boys were all being killed because the Egyptians were afraid of the Hebrews because they were growing in number very rapidly. And because of that, the Egyptians were afraid that they were going to be overtaken by the Hebrews. And therefore, the Pharaoh decides, let's put to death all of the Hebrew boys. And that way we can control the population, so to speak. There is an interesting story about this. I shared it in our Sunday school class, but none of them are in here right now, I don't think. So if you go back into history a little bit and you look at the King James Version of the Bible, this story actually has some influence on the King James Version of the Bible coming into existence. There was a translation that came into existence called the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was actually translated before the King James was, so it was in the late 1500s, I think 1598 or 99 one. And it was the first Bible that actually had something that you may have in your Bible, and that's a little bit of commentary at the bottom. And it was the first Bible translation that ever had that. So the Geneva Bible, when it came to chapter 2 of Exodus, when it speaks of Pharaoh telling the midwives to actually go and to kill the Hebrew boys as they were being born, the Geneva Bible says that the midwives were justified. In the commentary, it says they were justified in disobeying Pharaoh because they valued human life more than obeying Pharaoh. So King James, who was the king of the Church of England at this point in time, this goes back to early 1600s, reads the Geneva Bible and he sees where it says that these midwives were justified in disobeying Pharaoh. And so King James says in his mind, if I allow this to be spread throughout the Church of England and they all read it and they all see that they were justified in disobeying the Pharaoh, then we could have some terrible things happen here in England, and they could say that they're justified in disobeying the king or King James. So he said, we need a translation that doesn't have this commentary in it that we can circulate among our churches. It's not the only reason that the King James Bible came into existence, but it's one of the reasons that he commissioned this King James translation that we have today. So that's an interesting backstory that happens much later than what Moses' life is spoke of here in chapter 2. It is interesting that who wrote the book of Exodus? Who penned it, wrote it down? Moses, thank you. Moses wrote it. So as he writes Exodus, he's writing about his life as it comes into existence and how God had protected him to actually be able to make it into a teenager or a young adult or eventually to lead the children of Israel out. So as he writes this, he's writing about himself. God is inspiring it because he may not have known all the details, but he's writing about himself. It is interesting that we also find as you go into chapter 3, we quickly move into this moment in time that God calls Moses. And I want to read starting in chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro." So this is after Moses has killed the Egyptian that was beating on the Hebrew. It's after he had killed him, after he had come back the next day, and there were two Hebrews fighting, and Moses tries to talk to him and tell him not to, and one of the Hebrews says, "Are you just going to kill us too?" kind of thing. And then it becomes known that Moses is the one that had killed the Egyptian soldier, and so Moses flees, and he leaves Egypt at that time. And so chapter 3, and by the way, just as a little bit of an awareness, when Moses kills the Egyptian, what does that make Moses? A murderer. Now, we think sometimes that as individuals, when we've done some bad stuff in our past, we can't do anything for the Lord anymore. But Moses, as we remember and know, Moses was a murderer, we just established, but then he became what we would reference one of the greatest leaders in the children of Israel's history. As he leads them out of bondage in Egypt, he does make some mistakes along the way, but at the same time, God uses him, a murderer, to do something magnificent that would establish the children of Israel to go into the promised land after Moses has passed. So we have to dispel this thought, and we have to realize where this thought comes from when we have the idea that we can't do anything because what we've done in our past. That is Satan trying to prevent us from doing what God's calling us to do. And so we have to realize that's not God working in our life. That's Satan trying to prevent us. Moses was a murderer, we would say one of the baddest of the bad in terms of taking someone's life, and yet he's used in a mighty way for God. So look at verse 1 of chapter 3. "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burning. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. He said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now I want to stop there, and I want to talk about this interaction that God has with Moses. He appears in a burning bush, but does he call out immediately to Moses and say, Hey, I'm over here, come listen to me? We find that God appears in the burning bush, and yet Moses has to turn his attention to the bush. Now, I want you to think about this in your own life. And how many times has God appeared trying to get your attention, but it took a while for you to actually turn your attention to him? We don't know how long Moses saw this bush before he turned, but notice going back again, verse 2, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And then notice Moses makes this conscious statement to himself. He says, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burning. God does something here to try and get Moses' attention, but yet Moses still has to respond. God doesn't go to Moses and hit him over the head and say, you're going to do this for me. He appears, but Moses has to turn his attention to God. I wonder how many times and how many instances it takes for God to actually get our attention when He's calling us to do something. And I wonder sometimes, and most of our parents are in the back, but I wonder sometimes as a parent, how many times did He have to call out to us or create something like a burning bush in our life to get our attention about what our children is supposed to do, or in maybe your case, what your grandchildren is supposed to do. God appears here. Moses finally says, okay, I'm going to turn and see this great sight. And when he does, then we find, notice verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. He doesn't call to him before Moses has an interest in what's going on. He doesn't make Moses turn to him, but he waits until Moses is interested, and then he responds, or he calls out to him. I wonder if God has ever placed things in our life to get our attention of what we need to be doing, but yet we just don't respond to them. And so because we don't respond to them, we never hear God's voice telling us, this is what I need you to do. If we come on down to verse 7, after Moses is afraid to look at God, notice verse 7, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and all the ites people, if you read on down. I want you to notice out of that, this doesn't really have anything to do with Moses' life, but you see God make this statement that should be so comforting to us today. God sees what's going on in the children of Israel's life. It's not going unnoticed. He knows what's going on. And he's now, the time is right. Moses is ready to lead the people out. And so God comes and says, the plan can now be put in place for these people to come out. And you're going to be the one to lead them out. But notice that God says, I know what's going on there. I'm summarizing that. But I know what's going on. This is the same God then as it is today. When we sometimes get in the thought that God just doesn't see me or He doesn't understand what's happening in my life, we have to know that God sees everything happening, but He's waiting for the right time. Now, we could hypothetically say, what if Moses had not turned his attention to the bush at this point in time? What if Moses had looked and saw the bush that was burning, and he said, that's kind of interesting, but I've got these sheep that I got to tend to, so I'm going to go ahead and just tend to my flock and mind my own business, and whatever happens to the bush happens to the bush. At that moment in time, then, Moses is stepping outside of what God's will for his life would be. We don't know what happens to the children of Israel, and yet the plan that God has in place is now not happening in the right time that it should happen. Which may be the case in our own life when we don't pay attention to what God has for us. Thankfully, Moses listened. We find that God already knows what's going on in the life of the Israelites, and it's time for Him to do something about it. If you go down to verse 11, actually verse 10, God says, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. It would be great if Moses would have said, okay, I'm ready to go. But that's not what Moses says. And it's typically not what you and I say either. So notice what Moses does. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" He said, "But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." Then Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God says to Moses, one of these wonderful statements that we have in the Bible, "I am who I am." What a description of God, right? I am who I am. How do you question that? I am who I am. And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. And after that he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians." Now, this is an interesting string of events that goes on here, because Moses is arguing, I can't do what you want me to do. God says, don't worry about it. I got this. You're the God to lead them out. Well, who am I supposed to say is sending me? I am is sending you. And you go tell them that I am is sending you. And then, you would think that at this point God's trying to really build Moses up so that he doesn't have any doubt about what he's doing. But instead, God says, by the way, I know that the king of Egypt's not going to let you go. Now, that's a real morale booster, isn't it? You're going to go stand in front of the king of Egypt, and you're going to tell him, you need to let all the Israelites go. But I'm just telling you, he's not going to let them go. But then he says, but I'm going to do some great wonders. In other words, Moses, just sit back and watch what happens. But isn't that what God really wants us to do in life? To just trust Him and realize that He has a perfect plan if we will just sit back and let Him work. Because is it really anything that we do that makes stuff miraculous happen in this world other than just be obedient to God? So if we would just step back and say, God, you just do what you need to do. I'm going to be here to go talk to whoever you want me to talk to, but you just work. Because that's really what God's telling Moses. Just let me work. I'm going to do some magnificent stuff. You're going to get to see it. And by the way, you're going to leave with a lot of stuff. Now, this is the awesomeness of God that we see on display here, because this silver and gold that they leave with and all the stuff that they take, they don't just take that so that they have it, so that they can claim that we are the wealthiest people around here. They don't just take it so that the Egyptians have nothing, but God in His miraculous ways had a plan that there would be this, not temple, but tabernacle that would be built. And all of this stuff that they take from Egypt is actually going to be used to build the tabernacle. So God is not only leading them out, He's also providing them with what they're going to need in order for the tabernacle to be built, in order for them to be able to worship God in the way that they were going to worship Him or supposed to worship Him. What's interesting, though, is they take all this stuff out, and I'm skipping ahead quite a bit now, but they take all this stuff out. They get out wandering in the wilderness. Moses goes up on the mountain where he's going to get the 10 Commandments. And what does Aaron, his brother, allow them to do? Do you remember? Build a golden calf. Where did they get the gold to build the calf with? From the Egyptians, right? Their sons and their daughters wore it out. And they get out in the wilderness, and instead of using what God was going to use to build the tabernacle and all the stuff in the tabernacle, they use it to make a golden image, an idol, golden calf. Now, what do we take from that today? What do we learn from that situation where God is equipping them to use something to glorify Him, and yet they've taken it and they've used it to worship something other than Him? Does that ever exist in this world today? Just go ahead and everybody shake your head. Yes, it does. Because there's a good chance, and I'm not trying to be critical because it's happened in my life. There's a good chance that God has equipped me with something, and you too, you're not exempt from this. He's equipped all of us with something to use in a way to glorify Him, and yet we get it, and we go out, and we don't glorify Him with it, but we use it in a way that actually goes against Him. What a humbling thought to think that in the same way that God was preparing these children of Israel, and He was providing for them everything that they needed, and all they had to do was listen to Him. What a humbling thought to think that He's doing the same thing for us today. He's providing us everything that we need to glorify Him, to worship Him in the way that He would want us to, and yet sometimes we take it and we use it in a way that does not bring glory to Him. Now, I do think it's interesting as well, that last verse of chapter 3. About halfway down it, maybe a little more. He's talking about the silver and the gold and the clothing. And he says, you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. Why do you think, why didn't he say, all of you men are going to carry this out? But instead he says, you're going to put it on your sons, you're going to put it on your daughters, and you're going to have them walk out with it. Why is that? Okay, everybody's carrying part of the load. Any other thoughts? That's true. They are carrying part of the load. Any other thoughts as to why the sons and the daughters would actually be the ones that carry this stuff out? Wear it out, even.
Certainly the older generation had to pass away, so the younger generation would have been going to the promised land.
Okay. The older generation, we find once they get out in the wilderness, all the older generation dies. The younger ones would actually be the ones that get to go into the promised land. Could be some resemblance there to that. Any other thoughts about it? I'm going to guess y'all didn't cover this in class this morning, right? Yeah. Why does God speak so often about the next generations? We find it throughout Scripture, right? You get into Deuteronomy, he talks about, chapter 6, he talks about teaching the next generations. It's not only in Deuteronomy that you find that. You find it scattered throughout the Bible where the next generations are supposed to be taught. Why would God want the sons and the daughters to actually carry this stuff out? What are the sons and daughters going to learn as they walk out of Egypt with all this gold and silver and whatever else it is draped around their neck or on their fingers or carrying it with them? What are they going to learn?
Why they're doing it and what they're going to do with it.
Why they're doing it, what they're going to do with it? Aren't they going to learn that there's an awesome God that just allowed us to take all this stuff from the Egyptians and there wasn't even a sword that was drawn? But just at the name of God and what He had done, we're walking out with everything. Don't you think they remembered that? Hopefully they did. Now, we know they had their troubles when they got into the wilderness and they were wandering, right? We know that. But at the same time, when these kids, we don't know how old they are, but probably below the age of 13, when these kids grow up and they get about 30, 40 years behind them and they start thinking back to that time that they remember when they were in Egypt and they saw their mom and dad actually be slaves and they had to go out and make bricks so the Egyptians could build all these pyramids and whatever else it was that they built. Don't you think they thought back to the time that when they left Egypt and there wasn't a battle that took place, but the Egyptians gave them all of this stuff? And then what did we do with it? Well, there was a point where we stumbled and we kind of made a mistake and our parents used it in the wrong way. But then we kind of recovered after that and we turned back to God and we used it to actually build what God wanted us to build with it, and we made the tabernacle and we glorified Him. What a story that these young kids had to tell. And not only would they live it out and it reflect in their own life, but they were, according to Deuteronomy chapter 6, they're supposed to pass this on to the next generation and the next generation so that the faithfulness of God would be remembered by all generations. And God has given them a tremendous story to tell. Now, I want you to think about today. Do we have in our own life a tremendous story about God to tell? Has God been good to you in your life? Has He brought you through some times of being a slave in Egypt to a point where He showed you that He was truly God, and then He led you out of that enslavement in Egypt, and He brought you into a place where maybe you didn't do the right thing, but then you realized that you needed to do the right thing, and so you got back on track, and then you actually worship God in the way that you should. Don't we have that? If you're a believer here tonight, don't you have that story in your life? Is that not valuable for you to tell to the next generation? It's not always about telling the Bible stories. And I'm not saying that we don't tell the Bible stories, because we do. Kids need to know that. They need to be taught those. But sometimes it's about us telling what God's done in our own life. Because our personal testimony can be very influential to people who are looking for answers in the world. But if we never look back on how great God has been to us, then we never have that story to actually communicate and tell. So, we're to the point where God's saying, Moses, just do this stuff. Then look at chapter 4. God said, Moses, just let me work and it'll all happen. And Moses' answer in chapter 4 is, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. And the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, throw it to the ground. So he threw it to the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. So, God piqued Moses' interest by the burning bush. Moses turns his attention to the bush. God speaks to him in a mighty way, tells him what he's going to do. You just be obedient, follow me, I'll take care of everything. You're going to walk out of Egypt with all this stuff. And Moses' answer to that story is, they're not going to listen to me. Doesn't this sound foolish of Moses? And we're all afraid to say yes because we probably have all been here at some point in time. And the excuse that we've gave to God sounds just as foolish as the one that Moses has given. And so God then does something that really gets Moses' attention. He says, what's in your hand? He says, a staff, throw it down. He turns it into a snake. Now, I don't know if Moses is afraid of snakes or not, but I know that if that would have been Jennifer, she would have been a believer from here on out, if we would have caught her, because she would have been running somewhere away from that thing. How far does God have to go to get mine and your attention? Does he have to turn a stick into a snake in order for us to listen? Because he did with Moses. If he did with Moses, sometimes he may have to do it with us. But the goal is not to get that far before we listen to God. The goal is to learn from the stories that we read like this one and know that if God says it, we have to believe it. And so we find that, after this, look at verse 4. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of the fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. And again the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak. Now, it's interesting, between verse 5 and 6, we don't find that Moses said anything about, well, they're still not going to believe me. So God must have known that Moses still wasn't convinced at this point. So we find then verse 6, again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. And then Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and will teach you what you shall speak. But he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, now I'm just going to tell you, this is not a great place to be. When the anger of the Lord is kindled against you, that is not a good place to be. So in all of our excuses, we really need to learn to stop well short of where Moses got here. But Moses didn't stop. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. It is so true in our own life. And maybe I'm speaking for myself, so I'm not going to put you in this category. I'll let you put yourself there if you feel like you should be. But it is so true for my life at times where I forget that God is the creator of me, that he knows everything about me. He wove me together in the womb. He formed who I am. He made me who I am. He knows my abilities. He knows what I can't do. He knows what I can do. He knows if I can speak, if I cannot speak. He knows if I can stand in front of a crowd or not stand in front of a crowd. He knows if I can talk to this person or that person or whoever it may be. He knows all of that about me, just the way he knew it about Moses. And so he's telling Moses, go do these things. And why is he telling him to do them? Because he knows Moses can do them. He's not telling Moses to do anything that he can't do. And yet Moses still has questions about it. And I'm going to venture to say he has never told or asked you to do anything that you can't do. You may feel as though you can't. You may throw every excuse up that you can. But at the same time, do we not remember who created us? Who formed us in the womb? Who gifted us with every ability and talent that we have? And he knows how we can use them better than we know even how to use them. And so when he asks or tells us to do something, our response should be, God, I'm going to use what you gave me to go glorify you. Instead of, I can't speak. They're not going to listen to me. And so sometimes, because we know God's will is going to be accomplished, right? You believe that? So sometimes God has to kind of do this detour around us or around me. I wasn't going to throw you under the bus. Around me, because I'm not willing to do what he knows I can do, and so he has to do a detour around me to get to where his will be accomplished. And Aaron enters the picture at this point. Why do we want to make God detour? I don't want to, but I take my eyes off who my Creator is when I do that. And I don't realize that he knows that instead of having to do this detour, we can just do it if I'll just listen to him. So let's read on. Verse 18, chapter 4. Moses went back to Jethro's father-in-law and said to him, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. I wonder if Moses thought Jethro wouldn't let him go. I wonder if Moses was hoping Jethro wouldn't let him go. But, in hindsight, if Moses was thinking that, if he looked back, he would have to realize if God created this pathway for me to go, Jethro is not going to stand in the way. So, verse 19, the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Again, a very comforting statement from God, right? You're going to stand in front of Pharaoh, but I'm going to harden his heart, and he's not going to let you go. But go ahead and go stand in front of him anyway. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I shall say to you, let my son, and I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. At a lodging place along the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. And the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and they worshiped. Who better understood God, Moses or the children of Israel in that moment in time? Who do you think? Children of Israel, Moses and Aaron goes, stands in front of them, does the signs God told them to do. They believe, they bow their head, and they worship God. Did Moses ever worship God that we see recorded here? We don't find it so far, do we? Isn't that kind of interesting? The one that God calls to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, the one that he equips, the one that he argues with, the one that his anger is risen against, the one that he has to create this detour in order to get Aaron to come and speak for him because Moses just refuses to do it. Almost refuses to do it. And God reveals himself and tells him, I am the I am. And when they ask you, you tell them that I am sent you. But I'm going to lead you out. And by the way, when they go out, they're going to take all this stuff with them. And yet Moses never worships him, that we have recorded for us anyway.
He's probably too distracted with the thought that when I go back, I'm going to die. Because he knew when he left, if he came back, it was not going to be good,
Yeah.
The Lord said, you're going back. He's like, okay. But in the back of his mind, he's thinking, oh man,
Yeah, but God even, you're right, because that would have been my thought, like the people are going to kill me. But God even took that out of the equation because he said, and Moses didn't ask this, God just told him, the people that sought to kill you, they're dead. So he took that out of kind of took it out of the equation anyway. Moses may have still thought, well, there may be somebody there, Yeah. But it's interesting that you find Moses doesn't worship him, but the children of Israel do. They go back, Moses and Aaron, it's actually Aaron talking. Aaron delivers the message, and they worship. And I wonder sometimes if the messenger of God doesn't get it as well as the ones that get the message. So when we think about it sometimes as a parent, you ever had the moment, or a grandparent, you ever have the moment, or as a parent, you think back to your kids, maybe grown now, did you ever have the moment where you were trying to teach your kids, but then they kind of humbled you because they realized God better than you did? And that's kind of what went on here. It appears anyway. Any questions down through there? All right, flip over to Exodus chapter 32 then. We're going to kind of skip way ahead in the story. Hopefully you know a lot of the details in between, and we're just going to touch for just a moment on this. Chapter 32. Look at verse 1. Children of Israel have left Egypt. They've got out into the wilderness. Moses went up on the mountain. Everything goes wrong. Aaron lets them make the golden calf. They start worshiping it. Moses is about to come down. Verse 1. When the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand, fashioned it with a graving tool, and made a golden calf. And they said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, this is Aaron, who has witnessed all the things that God done in order to convince the Israelites to leave Egypt and to come out into the wilderness. And Aaron is now crafting this golden image. And who is he saying led them out of Egypt? He's not saying God, is he? He's actually saying that these gods, talking about the golden image, are the ones that led you out. How wrong can the detour be sometimes, even though God has to use it to do what we were supposed to do? Verse 5, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. Something's wrong there. We're worshiping gods that are not the Lord, but now we're going to worship the Lord with the golden calf. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" How hurt did God have to be at that moment in time? God done everything for them, brought them out, gifted them with everything that they come out with, has sustained them up until this point, and now they're saying, "Oh, it's not the I Am that brought us out, it's these other gods that brought us out." Verse 9, "And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you." But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'With evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth?' Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, 'I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides. On the front and on the back they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, 'There is a noise of war in the camp.' But he said, 'It is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear.' And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it." What a sad day that had to be. There was a lot of, I'm going to call it righteous anger that was going on here. God's righteous anger, Moses' righteous anger that was going on. Moses has to deal with these people. What did Moses do that helped him be able to deal with these people? What did Moses do in what we just read? What does he do that makes him or helps him be able to deal with the people? Any ideas?
Get through the tablets like I throw a wrench every once in a while. It's not what you're looking for.
I'm not sure that's the answer, but yeah.
Destroyed the calf, the golden calf.
He destroyed the calf, so he destroyed the image that they had created, which maybe made Moses feel a little better about things. What else could he have done that helped him be able to deal with the people? He talked to God about it. He actually turned to God, and he interceded in a way that we understand Christ interceding for us today. Because have we ever been the people that's made the golden calf? Probably so. Someone had to intercede for us. We see a glimpse of what Christ does here through Moses. Moses talks to God, and then he comes down, and after Moses sees it all, what does Moses do? he gets just as mad as God. Theoretically, as mad as God. And then at that point, Moses needs God to calm him down, because what he probably wants to do is not what he needed to do in the moment in time. But Moses doesn't leave him alone, because Moses could have threw his hands up in the air and said, these people are never going to listen. Moses did. When he talked to God, he retraced history. And he looked back at the promise that God had made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so as he's talking to God, Moses is also reflecting upon the goodness of God and the promise that God had made. Do we ever need to reflect back on the promise that God has made to us? And sometimes, even as maybe we're trying to make intercession, not that we're able to make intercession for somebody, but as we're trying to pray for someone, maybe we need to retrace history a little bit and see how God has worked in the past, so that when we deal with the situation, we maybe have a better remembrance of who God truly is. So Moses reflects backward, and he sees in his own mind who God is, and he talks to God about who he is. And then Moses goes and deals with the people. If the story ended here, it would be really sad. It doesn't, thankfully. The story continues on. Now, Moses makes mistakes. You know this, we're out of time. Moses made mistakes. He didn't get to go into the promised land because of that. God did let him see a glimpse of it. He gifted him, blessed him with that. But what he did allow Moses to do is to bring up someone that did get to lead them into the promised land. You remember that guy? Joshua, thank you. He did allow Moses to train the guy that was to go in. Now, if you've ever trained someone and you've seen them succeed, does that bring joy to your life? When you have a child that grows up and they serve the Lord in the way that you've taught them to serve the Lord, does that bring joy to your life? Think about Moses. He didn't get to go in, but he's able to see Joshua prepare to lead them in. And he knows that God is going to bless Joshua, and he knows that Joshua is going to be able to lead them in as they should. And so even though Moses made mistakes, God still blessed him with many things. As we think about this story in life, and I know our Sunday school lesson ended over in Numbers chapter 20. If you get a chance, go read that, the first few verses of chapter 20 in Numbers, and it's where Moses strikes the rock, which is what actually gets him in trouble. But as we think of all of Moses' life, Moses is a guy that we can see grows spiritually from the moment that God calls him to the moment that he's not allowed to do what he would really probably like to do, and that's to enter the promised land. But he grows spiritually, and when we get to the end, and even though he doesn't get to enter the promised land, is he angry with God about that? No. But he rejoices, actually, in knowing that he's just fulfilled what God has called him to do. There's a statement that was made, and I forget who makes it. You've probably heard it before, and I'll quote it wrong. But the essence of the statement is that we are to live, we are to teach God, and we are to die. And when you think about that in your life, God designs, forms us, equips us to do what we're supposed to do. We go out into the world, we do what we're supposed to do, and then we die. And if we do that, then we've done what God's called us to do. We know that there's a promise and a hope that when we die, it's not the end. But we fulfilled everything that we're supposed to do here on earth. Moses was able to rest at the end of his time knowing that he got the children of Israel to where they were supposed to be. They were about to go in. He didn't get to go with them in, but he got them to where they were supposed to be. It wasn't the same group of people that he left with. And when you start discipling people or training them, it's not always the people that you think you're training that you're training. But yet you get there at some point with some group of people. And if we do that, then we've done what God's called us to do. But in order to do it, we have to answer God's call that Moses answered. Finally, after he got through all the excuses, he finally assumed leadership after he realized Aaron couldn't do it. And he took it and he went with it and he done what God called him to do. Would you be willing to answer the call, respond to what God wants you to do, and then faithfully serve Him? And just worry about doing what God wants you to do, and then be rejoiceful in that you got there and you ministered to the people that God put in your life. And be content with doing that. Pray with me tonight if you would. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time you've given us. Lord, your blessings in life, the ability, Lord, to just be a servant of yours. And we know that you have gifted us with a great responsibility, but also a gift. That gift is to let us be a part of your kingdom. And Lord, being a part of your kingdom means that we get to rejoice in seeing others become a part of your kingdom. So Lord, as we look at stories such as Moses' life, I pray, Lord, that you help us to understand your call, to understand when you're trying to get our attention, to understand that you have equipped us in every way to do what we need to do. And Lord, to understand that we just need to be obedient. So I pray, Lord, that we become better at being the obedient servant you've called us to be. And I pray it all in your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Well, we appreciate you all.